I assume that you see my screen. So I'm very happy to present here, even though I don't have very much to say about oppressive speech. I hope that what I talk about does contribute to the main topic of this workshop series. It's a little bit a idyllic picture of about how communication should work. So maybe this is quite nice to see as a kind of complement to many of the talks that we have seen. I will talk about the marking and effects of assertoric strength. This is a topic that I'm working on in connection with this ERC project on speech acts in grammar and discourse, one of the topics that Stephanie just mentioned. So what is an assertion? I don't know why this happened. No, so yeah, okay. What do we do when we assert? Of course, we communicate information about the real world, or in case of novels and so on, about imaginary worlds at a given time. The question is, how do we do this? We update the information that is assumed to be shared in form of the common ground, a very important notion. I don't think I have to belabor this notion here. Then the question is, how do we actually update the common ground? One very simple picture is that the common ground is a set of world time indices C, and we update this simply by restricting it with a proposition phi, in this way as I indicated it here. Yeah, so it's a little bit like a movement in a game, like in a game of Go. You just do something and then the state of the game changes, and the HSC or the other player doesn't have anything to say if the rule was if the move was correct, then that's it. Yeah. But as a matter of fact, communication works differently, as we all know. The speaker has to induce the addressee to accept that move. Not everything that I say will be accepted as such, even if it's a correct move in some sense. It needs your consent. Yeah? Now, how do we get the addressee to accept? This is the main issue here. Well, one way of getting acceptance is by being a credible person. We normally have this as a default assumption when we ask someone the time on the street. We don't expect that people lie to us. Or when we know a person, we know something about the history of this person, about whether we felt cheated or misled or so before. And this will, of course, influence our decision whether we accept a current attempt to communicate a proposition. But there is also linguistic means that can be used to fine-tune or to change the strength of our assertoric moves, like sentence adverbials like seriously, or by God, or I swear. So seriously, I didn't break the vase is a stronger assertion in some sense, which is of course made with the intention that something that the addressee might not believe at face value, when I just say I didn't break the vase, might come to believe after all. Yeah. But then there are also ways that seem to weaken the assertion. When I say perhaps Bill did it, or I think Bill did it, or possibly Bill did it. There I seem to weaken the assertion and actually seem to be less convincing. But there are these ways of fine-tuning the level of an assertion as well. And my plan is to look a little bit into these linguistic means to fine-tune the nature of particular assertoric moves. Now, strength has been discussed by various authors. I just want to highlight 3 of them. There are certainly more. So strength was an important feature in the speech act theory by Searle and Vanderveken. So they assumed that speech acts differ in the strengths of their sincerity conditions. They were not very specific about that, but they had a level, a scale of, I think, up to 5 strength levels. And they also said that the strength can be modulated by intonation. What exactly they mean is not so clear, but it's, I think, quite obvious, and by sentence adverbs like sincerely, for example. They develop a theory by which they can identify different predicates that refer to speech acts. Like, for example, here, this is the field that Vanderveken has for assertive for terms for assertive speech acts, and they are modeled, they are depicted here in a way that the lower ones have lower strength and the upper ones have higher strength. I don't want to go into details here, just to illustrate that. The foundation, what strength actually means, is not very well developed in this theory, I can say. Then there is a interesting dissertation by Lavi Wolf on assertoric strength. The idea is that normally we have a certain probability level for propositions that is specific to the nature of the interchange. So small talk will be different from a police interview or so. And when there is a simple assertion, like S1 says that Bill broke the vase, then the speaker S1 expresses a belief in the proposition that this proposition has a certain high value of probability above some threshold value. Yeah, this can be modified in Bill certainly broke the vase. The threshold value is set to 1 according to Wolf. In Bill possibly broke the vase, the threshold value is greater than 0. Yeah, and so these are different kinds of assertions. And Wolf points out that epistemic adjectives, as in the sentence, it is possible that Bill broke the vase, work differently because there it is the proposition itself that is asserted, that expresses a certain level. Like in, it is possible that Bill broke the vase. This is a regular assertion about a proposition that expresses some possibility. Yeah. One problem of this is that certainly is actually known since a paper by Kartunen, weakens the assertion. A sentence like Bill certainly broke the vase is considered weaker, somehow easier to defend than the sentence Bill broke the vase. Yeah. Kartunen talked about must here, but this applies to certainly as well. The third paper I would like to mention is very recent by Incurvati and Schlöder. This is about what they call weak assertion. They develop a view of how common ground can be updated that allows for 2 different moves, asserting and rejecting a proposition. So adding phi to a common ground and adding not phi to a common ground are different moves. And a weak assertion, and they see the English particle perhaps as a marker of weak assertion, is such that if a speaker says perhaps Bill broke the vase, the speaker prevents not phi from being added to the common ground. It's not a statement that not phi is true or that phi is true, but a prevention that non-phi is added to the common ground. Yeah, and this is implemented in bilateral semantics with truth and falsity conditions. I don't go into details here. One problem is that there are also operators like certainly and probably and so on that seem to do different things than perhaps now perhaps and probably maybe quite similar, but certainly is different. And it's unclear how to express these operators in the system. Now let's have a closer look at assertion, and maybe we come up with a theory that tells us how we can change the strength of assertions. So there are, of course, a number of theories about assertions, and if you want to have more information, there is the Oxford Handbook of Assertion with wealth of very well digested information there. But basically, and this goes back to a classification in an article by McFarlane, there are those theories that say that, I have to do something here, that say that in an assertion, a speaker expresses a belief in a proposition, yeah, and if the addressee considers the speaker well informed and trustworthy, then the addressee will take over this belief. Yeah? And this explains, for example, the Moore's paradox that it's ought to say it is knowing, but I don't believe it. Yeah? But there is a difference between the assertion of it is knowing and the assertion I believe that it is knowing. The latter is in some sense considered different, weaker, and under the plausible assumption, which we can make, I think here, that if I believe a proposition, then I believe that proposition. Under the belief theory, this should come out more or less the same. It's unclear why we have the feeling that there are two different assertions, that the second is in some sense, in some very general sense, weaker. Yeah. Then there are theories that say that in an assertion, the speaker expresses a wish or maybe a command that the addressee should believe a proposition. Yeah. This explains what I called here the belief transfer paradox. It is paradoxical to say it is knowing, but I don't want you to believe it. This is, I think, as odd as Moore's paradox. But we can say things like, believe it or not, but it is knowing. So officially, we refrain from the wish that the addressee believes a proposition. And I know that this is used in a idiomatic way as well, but at face value, this seems to be a problem for this theory of assertion. And then there is the third view that actually is now, I think, very popular. This is the commitment view. In this view, the speaker declares a public commitment for the truth of a proposition phi. This explains what I call here the blame paradox. It is knowing, but don't blame me if it's not knowing. This is strange as well. And we can see that the other paradoxes can be explained as well. And I will talk a little bit about that. So the commitment theory of assertion goes back at least to Charles Sanders Peirce. One of the several quite telling quotes is this one here. An act of assertion supposes that a proposition being formulated, a person performs an act which renders him liable to the penalties of the social law, or at any rate, those of the moral law, in case it should not be true, unless he has definite and sufficient excuse. Yeah. So a commitment, a public commitment to a proposition is like vouching for the truth of a proposition. If it turns out that the proposition is true, the speaker has a problem. Yeah. So, and this can be now used to describe how a speaker can actually assert. So as one, the speaker vouches for the truth of a proposition phi. This is backed up by social sanctions. We want to avoid sanctions, of course. As two, the addressee takes this guarantee as a motivation to assume the proposition phi. And as one, of course, intends that as two knows that, and that as one intends it. So we communicate as one communicates the proposition phi ultimately by a conversational implicature. Yeah, so the speaker and the addressee know about the way how social commitments and sanctions and so on work. Yeah. This explains the various pragmatic paradoxes, like Moore's paradox can be explained by saying if you publicly commit to a proposition, better don't say at the same time that you don't believe it. This is like signing a contract for an apartment and say, I don't have the money actually to pay for it. Yeah, this would be as pragmatically odd as Moore's sentence. It is knowing, but I don't want you to believe that it is knowing is odd as well, because why should the speaker commit to a proposition if not for some purpose? And the typical purpose is that the speaker wants the addressee to believe the proposition. Yeah. But this is not always the case. As we have seen, we can say something like, believe me or not, or just for the record, it is knowing. So the speaker doesn't have faith that the addressee will actually come to believe the proposition, but for some other reasons like self-respect or whatever, the speaker might be compelled to commit to a proposition nevertheless. We can, of course, explain the blame paradox, and we can explain certain uses of assertions that are not communicative. So when Galilei said, "Eppur si muove," so, and it is moving. Galilei was certain that he couldn't convince the papal court anymore, but out of self-respect, he might have uttered this. This is maybe apocryphal, I don't know. And then we see assertions also as commitment to a creed, like in the Catholic Church, Credo in unum Deum, I believe in one God. Of course, this is not news when you say this in a church, but this is a public commitment to the truth of this proposition without there being any intent to communicate something new. Now, indicating commitment strength. As we have seen, we can, in an assertion, fine-tune, modulate the strength of an assertion. And I propose here that this is a modulation of the level and the nature of this public commitment. We can increase the commitment, and this means ultimately increasing the social risk that is attached to committing to the truth of a proposition. And this might give the addressee more reason to believe what I'm saying, because the risk that I as a speaker undergo is greater. And lowering, of course, on the other hand, decreases this social risk, and the proposition can be put forward as a suggestion to be further discussed, for example. Ways of fine-tuning this commitment level, well, we've seen that there are adverbials that are commitment raisers, like seriously, really. In German, we have echt, im Ernst, wirklich, wahrhaftig, and so on. It's quite a set of expressions, and every few days I think of or hear a new one, I must say. Then we can invoke witnesses, like by God, I didn't break the vase. There is an article about Arabic. Arabic is a language that uses this kind of way of raising commitments quite profusely, to a way that it doesn't mean very much anymore. So it has been sort of watered down. You hear it in many sentences. Yeah. And indicating emotional involvement might have a similar function, but it works, of course, in a different way. And there are a few articles on that as well. And there are explicit performatives, of course, like I swear I did not break the vase, or I did not break the vase, I swear, where the nature of the commitment is expressed by the speech act denoting predicate, in this case, swear, or I can lower the commitment by I guess, for example. So, so it seems that there are expressions in languages that indicate the level of the social commitment. But what about epistemic markers like certainly, probably, perhaps, and so on? Yeah. Now, Pierce has not only didn't only introduce this notion of commitment, but also the notion of judgment, a kind of commitment to oneself. So he says, what is the essence of a judgment? A judgment is the mental act by which the judger seeks upon himself the truth, seeks to impress upon himself the truth of the proposition. It is much the same as an act of asserting the proposition or going before a notary and assuming formal responsibility for its truth, except that those acts are intended to affect others, so the commitment, while the judgment is only intended to affect oneself. Yeah. And Frege actually in the thought, in the article The Thought, has something quite similar in mind. He distinguishes also because between something that can be seen as Peirce's commitment and something that can be seen as judgment. And for reasons of time, I don't go through that. You should be able to download the slides here. But basically, one can, Frege says that there are three things in an assertion. The first thing is the apprehension of the thought, the pure proposition. A second thing is the recognition of the truth of this thought, and a third one, the manifestation of this judgment, the assertion. Now, Frege didn't really focus on the social aspect of the assertion itself. This is something that Peirce would introduce into the discussion. And but this highlighting of the private judgment is important because it seems that there is a difference between a assertion like it will snow tomorrow, yeah, commitment to proposition, and I believe it will snow tomorrow, or it certainly will snow tomorrow. This can be seen as a commitment to a private judgment. Yeah, so this is the idea. It's a commitment as well, but to a different proposition, namely to a private judgment. So in the assertion, Bill broke the vase, I, as a speaker, commit to this proposition. In the assertion, I believe Bill broke the vase, I commit to my private judgment. Yeah. This gives the impression of a weaker assertion. And this is, as I said, difficult for the belief theory of assertions to explain. The assertion, I am certain that Bill broke the vase, also expresses a commitment to a private judgment, namely that I consider this proposition as certain, but interestingly, it is weaker in the sense that it is easier to defend. So if the other speaker says you are a liar because Bill didn't break the vase, I could still retreat and say, no, I was really certain about that. And the other person cannot prove that I was not certain about that. In this sense, this is a proposition that would be easier to defend. And so it's safer in some sense. Yeah. So that's essentially the idea about commitments to private judgments. They can communicate the proposition as well in a way that is easier to defend because it cannot be challenged that easily anymore, because the speaker can retreat to saying, well, this was my private judgment of this proposition. Now, I try to see what one would get by taking this seriously, that there is, in assertions, there is a commitment, and in some assertions, there is also the expression of private judgments to which the speaker commits himself or herself. Yeah? Partly with inspiration by previous work by Hengefeld, this was in functional setting, I tried to develop a proposal, and you can see this is not published yet, but you can see this on Linkbus, in which Frege's distinctions are represented by distinct syntactic layers. Yeah. So I distinguish between a tense phrase, this is Frege's thought or the proposition, a judge phrase, a commitment phrase, and an act phrase with their own syntactic heads, and they mean something different. So these are propositions, judgments, commitments, and commitment states or common ground updates. Yeah. So using X-bar theory as a commonly accepted syntactic theory, one could start out with a little VP. This is not even a proposition because it's not tensed yet. Then we can construct a proposition out of that. This would be Bill broke the vase with a past tense operator. Then the next level would be a judgment operator, a judgment phrase, yeah, with a head. This would be the head of the judgment phrase. The next level would be a commitment operator. I use the turnstile here as the head of the commitment phrase, and then there would be a act phrase. The dot operator here creates a assertive update. A question would be represented by a different operator, and I don't talk about questions here. Yeah. One can assume, but I'm not so certain about English and German, this is much clearer, optional movement of heads and the subject to higher projections is here, for example, the verb broke here moved to the level of the commitment operator here. This would be head movement. Now, what is the evidence for these layers? Well, we have speech adverbials. On the one hand, we have judgment adverbials that are somehow interpreted within the judgment phrase. Yeah. So cases in point of such judgment operators are certainly, apparently, and unfortunately. So for epistemic, evidential, and evaluative operators, so they would be modifiers in the judgment phrase. Yeah. They correspond to three classes that you also find with Cinque's theory of adverbials and adverbial projections. For him, these would be heads, but I think there's not much evidence that they are heads. And there are commitment adverbials, and they are interpreted within the commitment. A phrase like seriously or sincerely or truly and so on would be interpreted in the commitment phrase. And yes, sometimes you can combine these adverbials and a judgment adverbial. This often sounds a little bit overloaded, but there are cases where you find combinations. And then there are speech adverbials like frankly, for example, a well-known adverbial that indicates something about the speech act itself. Frankly, for example, indicates some breach of politeness or of consideration, of respect, and so on. They don't really raise or lower the level of the commitment, but they do something else about the speech act. Yeah. And these different projections also occur in embedded clauses. I don't go into this here. Now, we can interpret these different layers in a compositional way. Yeah. So using this common format of a expression, and the double brackets are the meaning of this expression, and there can be parameters like the subject, the addressee, the speaker, the addressee, and a judge. We can start with a TP. This is a proposition, like Bill broke the vase, is something like that. I abbreviate this with phi, a function from indices to truth values, but there are these parameters here. The parameter of the judge is relevant for personal and taste predicates, like in Bill, this idiot broke the vase. So the idiot would be dependent on the judge parameter. Then on the judge phrase level, the judge operator is made available here. This X here is interpreted as the judge operator here. This is not very visible here. I shortened this too much that you can see what's going on here, but X stands here for J. This means that the next level then, the commitment phrase introduces a operator that corresponds to the head of this commitment phrase here, resulting in a function from a person X into the proposition that X is committed to the core proposition. In this case, that Bill broke the vase. So this is this here for short. So X is committed to phi, and this is itself a proposition which is not indicated here. I just wanted to keep things short. Yeah, and the judge is identified with the committer here. Now, from propositions to acts, the last step, in my view, works like as follows. We have a update of a common ground. A common ground can be modeled in the simplest way as a set of indices. Yeah, I assume here indices that are ordered, temporarily ordered from top to bottom. And when a proposition is true or false at indices, at the dark points here, the proposition phi is true. Yeah. A common ground C is a subset of indices like that. Yeah, it's how the world at the current time could look like, and so therefore this is a subset here that sort of cuts out a slice of indices that happen at the same time. And yeah, I am aware that sometimes it is an issue which time it is, and then this is not a simple slice like that because the exact time as such is at issue. Then we have a so-called informative update. This is the update that we know from Steinlecker's work. So this common ground C can be updated with a proposition phi, and so it is restricted to those indices in which phi is true as well. Yeah. But then there is also another type of update, performative update that Anna Szabolcsy introduced. This is a minimal change of the indices of a common ground so that the proposition is true. Szabolcsy uses this symbol here, I plus phi is a minimally changed index from I so that phi is true, and everything that is logically, it follows logically from phi, of course, will be true here as well. And so when we want to depict this, we get this picture here. So the common ground here is updated in a way minimally that the proposition phi becomes true. Yeah. This is a performative update. Now, assertions can be seen as introducing commitments. So with, yeah, on the level of the act phrase, we get this function from input common ground C into outputs that change insofar as the speaker S is now committed to phi. And this is not a a informative update, but a performative update. The speaker changes in some sense the world that after this assertion, now the speaker is committed to the truth of this proposition. Yeah. And the committer is, of course, identified with the speaker here. Yeah. So this would be an example with a concrete input common ground C0 and a concrete speaker S1. Yeah. Now the speaker is committed to the truth of the proposition, and as we have seen, this is a reason for the addressee to assume the proposition phi as well, and this is a second step. The second step would be a informative update. Yeah. In case the speaker is trustworthy, the addressee will take phi to be true, and phi will be enriched. And if the addressee doesn't say anything, the speaker can normally assume that the addressee did perform this second update with phi as well. So that's the general idea here. Yeah. Now let's look at the two kinds of modifiers: judgment modifiers and commitment modifiers. So let's just look at epistemic operators here, like certainly. Yeah. In certainly, Bill broke the vase. I said that certainly is part of the commitment of the judgment phrase. Let's just have a very simple representation of this epistemic operator, saying that the judge is certain about a proposition phi, so the judge X considers it highly likely that in this case Bill broke the vase. Then the speaker commits to this proposition, and the committer is identified with the judge, and at the end there is a performative update by the speaker with this commitment. And now if the speaker commits to the truth that the speaker considers a proposition highly likely, this can be a good reason for the addressee to also assume this proposition. And if there is no voice disagreement also, the proposition will be communicated as well. But as I would like to point out here, with a commitment by the speaker only to his or her own epistemic stance that the proposition is considered very likely, yeah, not to the proposition itself. And this is a commitment that is easier to defend. Yeah. There's one prediction about that, namely that the epistemic attitude expressed must be positive, and this is well known. We cannot say Bill did not certainly break the vase, and this is very systematic. And the reason for that is that by negating the indicated epistemic stance, there is no reason for the addressee anymore to assume the proposition. So the whole purpose why the speaker expresses a commitment to his or her own epistemic attitude towards a proposition is lost, because ultimately the goal is to communicate the core proposition. And this is different with epistemic adjectives, like in it is certain or it is not certain that Bill broke the vase. This is part of the communicated proposition itself. And here the epistemic authority is not necessarily the speaker. The speaker appeals to some other recognized authority here. Yeah. So there is this difference. I don't go to evidentials and evaluative for reasons of time. They work sort of similarly. Yeah. Let's look at commitment modifiers. They typically raise the level of commitments. As in Bill seriously broke the vase, they are interpreted with, as I said, within the commitment phrase. And they do something about the commitment itself. expressed in this case that X is seriously committed to the proposition phi. Yeah. What does this mean? Well, with a serious commitment, the speaker indicates I put a higher stake on my commitment to a proposition. I express maybe that this is not bullshit communication or so. There are, of course, different settings in which the nature of the commitments differ. And here, this, in this case, expresses that this is a piece of, this is an assertion that is done under the rules that the commitment is serious, that the addressee has a right to complain in case the proposition turns out to be wrong, false. Yeah.
Manfred, could I just break in here? The 35 minutes are up, so we were just going to ask if you could
I need to
wrap up fairly quickly.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks.
This is actually about my last slide. Now, with a modified assertion like as in Bill seriously broke the vase, the speaker performs an update with the proposition that S1, the speaker is seriously committed to the proposition. And this update is not up to negotiation. This is a performative update. Yeah. The speaker is doing this for the purpose of introducing the proposition phi into the common ground. This is the ultimate purpose here. Consequently, the contribution of seriously is not part of what is at issue. It's not part of the answer to a question under discussion. It's a means to answer the question under discussion. It's not part of it in some sense. Yeah. And the same with other operators, like with apparently and certainly, they are also not part of the question under discussion. They are means to answer this question with a type of commitment that is that the speaker can live with also. Yeah. My last point is that this way of what is at issue and what is not at issue is something that I'm currently very much interested in. I don't think that a two-dimensional approach like with Potts or Gutmann is very helpful here. There is one approach saying that we have to look at the propositional discourse reference that are introduced on these various levels. So in Bill seriously broke the vase, we can assume, this is shifted here, that the TP Bill broke the vase introduces a propositional discourse referent that can be picked up, but the commitment phrase here does not introduce a propositional discourse referent. It cannot be picked up. Yeah. And one can see this, that we cannot address seriously with any reaction here. Yeah. It's a little bit more tricky with the operators that relate to the judgment phrase. In Bill certainly broke the vase. A reaction like that's right can include the meaning contribution of certainly here, I think. And so we have to think about why is this typically not part of an answer to the commitment, to the question under discussion. And my proposal, and I will end here, is that the question under discussion is addressed by the focus within the tense phrase, within the TP. So in stress on the vase, for example, can, as we know from theories about focus projection, answer any of these three questions here. But the focus projection cannot extend to include a epistemic or evidential adverbial. It stops here. It stops at the TP. Yeah, and therefore, material that is outside of the TP cannot contribute to identifying the question under discussion. And if you are interested in a way to model the question under discussion in a dynamic framework, I can point to this paper. This is about Turkish, but this gives a way to model the question under discussion as part of the input common ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manfred. Okay, so we'll open it up for questions. We have just a bit over 15 minutes for questions. What I'd like to ask is for anyone who has a question, please type Q in the chat. And since we're particularly interested in giving junior scholars a chance to ask questions, if you are a PhD student or a junior postdoc and you'd like to ask a question, you can preface your Q in the chat with J and we'll give you priority. So, do we have questions? After that.
Thank you very much for the talk, Manfred. So I have a question about the grounding of the propositional content of an assertion. So you said that it comes about as a conversational implicature, and to me that seems problematic for at least two reasons. So one being that on this account, it seems that reactions to assertions become somewhat either redundant or problematic for different reasons. So for instance, something like an agreement seems very redundant act on this account. So because if you have an assertion and phi gets part of the common ground, why should I agree on it? And on the other hand, if you have a conversational implicature and it goes through, then rejecting it seems to implicate that I had to change my mind on the subject matter. So that seems not to be the case usually in rejections. So that seems problematic. The other thing one would have to explain is, I think, is that, so when does phi become part of a common ground? So when does the conversational implicature goes through? Because it seems, to me at least, not very reasonable to say that the speaker of the assertion can cancel it. So these were my questions then. Yeah,
it's a conversational implicature in the sense that it can be derived given these the setup by pragmatic reasoning. So this addressee knows that the speaker committed to the truth of a proposition. This is backed up by sanctions. There must be some reason for undergoing this risk, and one very plausible reason, but not the only one, is to communicate this proposition. So, and then, well, I, as the addressee, have good reasons to believe it. So this is the reason why I call this a conversational implicature. Now, it is for the reactions. We expect reactions by the other person, like or okay, and you are working on that actually. There is also the reaction, yes, that's right, where the other speaker commits to the same proposition as well. So one can distinguish between simply admitting a proposition and asserting the proposition as well, so backing it up with one's own commitment. And as for canceling, in some sense, the believe it or not seems to prevent, at least officially, the intention to communicate the proposition. But of course, I'm aware of that specifically the believe it or not is now conventionalized to be is a marker to express a proposition is something difficult to believe. But the just for the record is, I think, a better example. So in just for the record, there are uses of that where the intention to communicate a proposition is actually seems not to be there.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll turn it over then to Nicholas for the next question.
Hi, Manfred. There's some curious interactions between these adverbials, and I just wonder what you thought about them. And so some of them we can conjoin. I just found this one on the web. Frankly and unfortunately, 2021 seems to be a repeat of 2020. Yeah. And they're of different levels, if I understood. So that, I know it makes me uneasy that we have to do, I mean, we can get them to be of the same type if we push everything up, but it's, I guess I don't really see that motivation so much. And then some of them don't go together at all. So it seems like.
Certainly, yeah. I'm aware of that. I found for German, a number of examples, and they behave in this hierarchy that the commitment modifiers are syntactically higher than the judgment modifiers, but this is rare. So and the reason for that is, I think, that different from the building up of a complex proposition within the TP, we sort of need a lot of material to express a certain thought. Everything that is above the TP are just instruments, in some sense, to fine-tune the way how we assert the proposition, and there is much less reason to fine-tune that.
But you wouldn't expect these two types to be conjoined, would you? They're distinct levels. They take distinct objects.
Or I see conjoined, really conjoined with and.
Yeah, no, I just found it on the internet, frankly and unfortunately.
I see, okay. Frankly, yeah, I cannot say very much about that. That's interesting, yeah.
It's kind of counter evidence for two syntactic levels.
Yeah. Now, the way how these operators can be used is they can, I think, occur as modifiers in their particular places, but also as parentheticals. And then they are more liberal in their syntactic position. And as parentheticals, I understand this as being separated, internationally separated from their surroundings. And this might allow for a conjunction, but yes, you are right. So one would have to look at when conjunction is possible, actually. Yeah, I was more interested in whether they can co-occur at all, and the co-occurrence of say two or more of these operators in the same assertion is quite rare.
Yeah, it's heavy, as you said. It's heavy.
Yeah. Also, for example, you can fine-tune certain as an adjective, like it is 75% certain that it will rain tomorrow, but you cannot use this as an adverb, for example. It will 75% certainly rain tomorrow is completely impossible. So you see the restricted semantics that you have outside of the TP, but there is a semantics, I would argue.
Thanks. So do we have any further questions? If not, I'll jump in with a question of my own, but I'll see, give others priority. Okay, since we have a couple minutes, I guess I'll ask a question. Manfred, you'd mentioned early on that these commitment raisers might work by raising the social penalties of, I think I'm not getting your exact wording right, but raising the social penalties of saying something false. I have a sense that they don't all work in the same way, and I wondered your thought on that. So it's sort of, I swear that I didn't bring the vase does seem to work by committing myself to some sort of social penalty if I didn't break if I am lying, whereas seriously, my intuition would be it would be doing something different. So I'm curious your take on that and how that could be accounted for.
Yeah, I agree that this is not just a level as with Vanderveken from 1 to 5 or so. So this is certainly not the right way to think about that. So with seriously, I think one indicates a little bit like the type of game that one is playing with assertions, that this is no joke now, yeah, and it's not say just small talk or bullshit talk or so. Of course, this doesn't mean that you cannot use seriously in bullshit talk. You can use it, of course. Yeah,
We do.
it's the weird and difficult thing that but it was intended, or it is intended, I think, to indicate that this is now a serious piece of information, and there's certainly evidence that in many uses it marks a kind of different kind of responsibility. In general, I don't really know what's going on with these expressions. There are many. They seem to be quite unsystematic. It's always surprising to see what there is. So in German, there is this ungelogen, for example, or in my native Bavarian, there is ohne Schmarrn, and so on. One is actually constantly amazed about these things, and actually would like to urge people that are interested in that to look into these markers, because they are totally under-researched. Also, the differences between speech communities is quite interesting, that in certain communities like Arabic, for example, or Turkish, you find many more of these markers without them having the same importance anymore. So one expects them, they sort of lost their value. It's a kind of inflation that you can see here.
Like the inflation of literally to mean something very
exactly
different than
yeah.
that.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Because this would be very interesting to look at language change here. Yeah.
Back to my chair role. Do we have any final questions? Well, if not, I will suggest that we wrap up this session, and we will recontinue in 10 minutes at 10 after 3 for the next talk. Thanks very much, and let's thank Manfred for the talk.